The polished mahogany doors of Sterling Innovations' executive suite swung open, but Marcus Sullivan didn't recognize the woman seated behind the CEO's desk as the wife he'd divorced 3 months earlier. Rebecca Sterling had transformed from the modest accountant he'd abandoned into an unrecognizable vision of corporate power. But her cold emerald eyes held memories of his betrayal, the affair with Jennifer Walsh, his mistress from the marketing department, the divorce papers he'd shoved across their kitchen table, the cruel words about her inadequacy. He'd applied for the senior management position, never knowing his ex-wife was the secret CEO of the billion-dollar empire. But now he stood frozen in her office doorway, his resume trembling in his hands. The company he'd researched obsessively belonged to her, but he'd been too blinded by arrogance to connect Rebecca Sterling to Rebecca Sullivan, too consumed with his new marriage to Jennifer to investigate the mysterious CEO whose identity remained hidden from the public. His mouth opened to speak, but no words emerged as Rebecca's perfectly manicured fingers tapped against documents that revealed not just her position, but something far more devastating, a $450 million inheritance she'd kept secret throughout their 7-year marriage, an inheritance that had funded every dream he'd ever claimed as his own achievement. The interview he'd prepared for had transformed into a reckoning, but Marcus couldn't comprehend how the woman he'd deemed worthless now held his entire future in her hands. What would Rebecca do now that her ex-husband sat before her, desperate for employment in the empire she'd built? How had the wife he'd underestimated become the most powerful CEO in the industry? What secrets had she hidden during their marriage? And why had she concealed a fortune that dwarfed his wildest ambitions? Would she grant him mercy or exact revenge for the affair that destroyed their marriage? And could Marcus survive the revelation that everything he'd achieved had been built on her silent generosity? The morning had started like any other Tuesday for Marcus Sullivan, but his confidence would soon crumble into dust before the day ended. He'd polished his Italian leather shoes until they gleamed, but the reflection staring back at him in the mirror showed a man who'd built his self-worth on illusions. His navy Tom Ford suit hugged his athletic frame perfectly, but beneath the expensive fabric beat the heart of a man who'd made the worst decision of his life exactly 93 days ago. Sterling Innovations occupied floors 40 through 60 of the Millennium Tower downtown, but Marcus had never questioned why the company's leadership remained mysteriously absent from all public events. The tech empire had revolutionized cloud computing infrastructure, but its reclusive CEO had become an urban legend in business circles, brilliant, ruthless, and completely invisible to the media. Forbes estimated the company's worth at $3.2 billion, but nobody could put a face to the name Rebecca Sterling. Marcus stepped into the chrome elevator, but his thoughts drifted to Jennifer, his new wife of 2 months, who'd been the catalyst for the divorce that now haunted his sleep. She'd been everything Rebecca wasn't, or so he'd convinced himself, during those heated encounters in supply closets and hotel rooms during his previous job. Jennifer had legs that seemed to stretch forever, but her beauty had blinded him to her toxic manipulation. She'd whispered promises about the life they'd build together, but those promises had evaporated the moment his divorce finalized and his bank account revealed its disappointing reality. The elevator climbed higher, but Marcus's mind descended into the memory of that October evening when he'd served Rebecca divorce papers. She'd been sitting at their kitchen table reviewing spreadsheets, but her dedication to her work had always irritated him, made him feel small, insignificant, like an accessory to her life rather than its centerpiece. He'd accused her of being married to her career, but now he recognized his words as projections of his own inadequacy. "I want a divorce," he'd announced, but Rebecca hadn't even looked up from her laptop initially. When she finally raised her eyes, they'd held no surprise. but pain had flickered across her features for just a moment before she'd masked it with that infuriating calm she always maintained. "Is it Jennifer from your office?" she'd asked quietly, but her voice had carried no accusation, only resignation. The question had angered him more than tears would have, but he'd forged ahead with cruelty he'd later regret. "At least Jennifer makes me feel like a man," he'd spat, but Rebecca had simply nodded and signed the papers without argument, without fighting for their 7 years together, without revealing any of the secrets that would soon detonate his world. The elevator dinged at floor 55, but Marcus's stomach lurched for reasons having nothing to do with the rapid ascent. The reception area screamed money, abstract art that probably cost more than his annual salary, furniture that belonged in design museums, and a receptionist whose beauty rivaled any model's, but whose eyes assessed him with the coldness of someone who saw through his carefully constructed facade. "Marcus Sullivan for the 10 o'clock interview," he announced, but his voice cracked slightly on his own name. The receptionist smiled without warmth, but her fingers flew across her keyboard with practiced efficiency. "Ms. Sterling is ready for you. Conference room A, down the hall, last door on your right," she instructed, but something in her tone made the hair on his neck stand up, a knowing quality that suggested she understood something he didn't. Marcus's shoes clicked against marble floors, but each step felt heavier than the last. The hallway displayed photographs of Sterling Innovations' achievements, groundbreaking software launches, charity initiatives, partnership announcements with Fortune 500 companies, but one detail nagged at his consciousness. Every photo carefully avoided showing the CEO's face, always capturing her from behind or in shadow. The conference room door stood slightly ajar, but Marcus paused to straighten his tie and check his reflection in the glass wall. He looked good. He always looked good, but for the first time in his life, he wondered if his appearance might not be enough to carry him through this interview. The position paid $340,000 annually, but more importantly, it represented a lifeline after Jennifer's spending habits had decimated his savings in their brief marriage. He pushed open the door, but the woman behind the desk had her back to him, studying the city skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. Her auburn hair cascaded down her back in waves that caught the morning light, but something about her posture triggered a familiarity he couldn't quite place. "Mr. Sullivan," she said without turning, but his blood turned to ice because he knew that voice, had heard it whisper words of love during better days, had heard it crack when he'd announced his affair, had heard it wish him well with mechanical politeness as they'd signed their divorce settlement. She turned slowly, but Marcus's brain refused to process what his eyes clearly showed him. Rebecca, his Rebecca, except she wasn't his anymore and perhaps had never been, regarded him with the detached interest of a scientist examining an insect under glass. But this Rebecca bore little resemblance to the woman he'd shared a bed with for 7 years. Gone was the woman who'd worn her brown hair in a practical bun, but in her place sat someone transformed by expensive highlights and a cut that framed her face like a work of art. Gone were the discount store clothes she'd claimed were practical, but now she wore a Chanel suit that probably cost more than their monthly mortgage used to be. Gone was the woman who'd let him dominate every conversation, every decision, every aspect of their shared life, but now she radiated the kind of power that made CEOs and politicians nervous. "Rebecca?" Marcus's voice emerged as a strangled whisper, but she raised one perfectly arched eyebrow. "Ms. Sterling in professional settings, but I suppose given our history, you can call me Rebecca during this interview," she replied, but her tone held no warmth, no recognition of their shared past beyond clinical acknowledgement. "Please sit." Marcus's legs moved without conscious thought, but he collapsed into the leather chair facing her desk. More than sat. His carefully prepared opening statement evaporated from his mind, but questions tumbled over each other in a cascade of confusion and dawning horror. You're the CEO? He managed, but even as he said it, the pieces began clicking into place with devastating clarity. Sterling, her maiden name, the name she'd never changed despite his insistence that she take his surname. Innovations. She'd been working in tech consulting when they'd met, but he'd never paid attention to the details of her career, too focused on his own ambitions. I am, but you seem surprised, Rebecca observed, but she leaned back in her chair with the confidence of someone who held all the cards and knew it. You didn't recognize the company name when you applied? You didn't wonder about the CEO who shares my exact name? Or perhaps you were too busy with your new bride to do proper research. The barb landed with surgical precision, but Marcus forced himself to think through the fog of shock. You were an accountant. You worked from home. You never... He trailed off, but the defense sounded pathetic even to his own ears. I was never an accountant, but I let you believe that because it made you comfortable, Rebecca corrected, but her fingers steepled beneath her chin in a gesture he'd never seen her make during their marriage. I founded Sterling Innovations 9 years ago, 2 years before we met, but I learned early in our relationship that you needed to feel superior. Every time I tried to share my success with you, you became hostile, diminished, threatened by accomplishments you couldn't claim as your own. Marcus opened his mouth to protest, but memories flooded back with uncomfortable clarity. The time she'd tried to tell him about landing a major contract, but he'd cut her off to brag about his own minor promotion. The evening she'd attempted to explain her company's IPO, but he'd accused her of showing off and deliberately making him feel inadequate. The countless moments when she'd started to speak about her work, but his disinterest had been so palpable that she'd simply stopped trying. I worked from home because I had a private office on the 60th floor where I run this company, but I left the house each morning after you did and returned before you, Rebecca continued, but her voice remained eerily calm, the tone of someone reciting facts rather than expressing emotions. I told you I was an accountant because it was the simplest explanation you'd accept without feeling threatened. I never wore expensive clothes around you because you once commented that my Anne Klein dress made you feel less than. I hid who I was because I loved you, but apparently that still wasn't enough to keep you faithful. The accusation hung in the air between them, but Marcus couldn't deny its truth. He'd cheated, lied, and ultimately abandoned her for Jennifer, who was currently at home in their modest apartment, complaining about the neighborhood and demanding they move somewhere more prestigious, somewhere his current unemployment made impossible. Why didn't you tell me? Marcus asked, but even he recognized the question's absurdity. We were married. You should have... I should have what? Rebecca interrupted, but her calm finally cracked to reveal the anger beneath. I should have risked your ego. I should have watched you shrink into yourself because your wife was successful. I tried, Marcus. God knows I tried in the beginning, but every time I achieved something, you either ignored it or found ways to diminish it. So yes, I hid. I hid my success, my company, my money, all of it, because I wanted to preserve our marriage more than I wanted recognition from my own husband. Marcus's hands gripped the armrests of his chair, but his knuckles whitened with the pressure. The divorce settlement. You gave me half of everything. The house, the savings accounts, the investment portfolio, none of which represented even a fraction of my actual wealth, but I see you've begun to understand the scope of your mistake, Rebecca said, but she pulled a folder from her desk drawer and slid it across the polished wood toward him. That's your portfolio, by the way. The investments you thought you made so cleverly. I funded them. The house you believed you earned through your hard work. I bought it. The car, the country club membership, the vacation home in Aspen. All of it came from money I carefully funneled through accounts you could access, all so you could feel like the provider you so desperately needed to be. Marcus opened the folder with trembling fingers, but the documents inside painted a devastating picture of his own delusion. Transaction records showed money flowing from Sterling Innovations into accounts bearing his name. But every deposit originated from Rebecca's personal holdings. Investment statements revealed that the portfolio he'd proudly managed had been seeded with her capital, but his brilliant stock picks had actually underperformed the market by 15%. Losses she'd quietly absorbed without comment. "I don't understand," Marcus said, but his voice cracked with the weight of revelation. "Why would you do this? Why hide everything? Why let me believe?" "Because I loved you, but apparently love makes people foolish," Rebecca answered, but her eyes glistened with unshed tears she refused to let fall. "I loved the man I thought you were when we met, charming, funny, ambitious in a healthy way. But you changed, Marcus. Or perhaps you never changed, and I simply refused to see who you really were. You became obsessed with status, with appearing successful, with the image of success rather than its substance. And every time I tried to share my actual success with you, you turned it into a competition I never wanted to enter." Marcus's mind raced backward through their marriage, but now he saw it through a different lens. Every argument about money recontextualized, every business trip she'd taken revealed as crucial meetings she'd downplayed, every late night at the office exposed as hours spent building an empire while he'd watched television and complained about her absence. "Jennifer doesn't know, does she?" Rebecca asked, but the question felt more like a statement. "Your new wife has no idea that you left a billionaire for a marketing associate who makes $67,000 a year. Does she know you're unemployed? That you've been living off the divorce settlement that will run out in approximately 7 months, given her spending habits?" The surveillance implications of that statement should have angered Marcus, but he felt too numb to muster outrage. "You've been watching me? I keep tabs on threats to my company, but you became one the moment you applied here," Rebecca replied, but she pulled up a file on her computer screen and turned it toward him. "Jennifer Walsh, your new wife, has been documenting your assets since before your divorce was finalized. She has screenshots of your bank accounts, photos of your investment statements, and a consultation scheduled next week with a divorce attorney specializing in high net worth cases. You're her third husband in 5 years, but the first 2 were smart enough to get prenuptial agreements." The information hit Marcus like a physical blow, but he couldn't even summon surprise at Jennifer's betrayal, just a hollow recognition that he'd destroyed his marriage to Rebecca for a woman who'd seen him as nothing more than a mark. "Why show me this?" Marcus asked, but his voice emerged barely above a whisper. "Why not just reject my application and let me figure it out on my own?" Rebecca studied him for a long moment, but her expression remained unreadable. "Because despite everything, despite your affair and your cruelty and your desperate need to feel superior to me, I spent 7 years of my life with you. 7 years of hiding who I was, diminishing my accomplishments, pretending to be less so you could feel like more, and I think you deserve to understand exactly what you threw away." She pressed a button on her desk phone, but her assistant's voice crackled through the speaker. "Send in Mr. Chen." Marcus turned toward the door, but confusion replaced his shock for a moment. A distinguished Asian man in his 60s entered, but he carried a leather portfolio that radiated legal significance. "Marcus Sullivan, this is David Chen, my family attorney," Rebecca introduced, but she gestured for the lawyer to sit. "David, please explain Mr. Sullivan's financial situation to him." David Chen opened his portfolio with practiced efficiency, but his expression held no judgment, just professional detachment. Mr. Sullivan, I've been instructed to inform you of certain facts regarding your financial history. First, the house you received in the divorce settlement was purchased entirely with funds from Ms. Sterling's personal inheritance. Second, the investment portfolio you currently control was seeded with $750,000 of her money. Third, every major purchase you made during your marriage, including vehicles, property, and luxury items, was funded through accounts Ms. Sterling maintained for this purpose. Marcus felt his world tilting on its axis, but the revelations weren't finished. Additionally, I must inform you of the inheritance you mentioned in the title of this meeting, David continued, but he slid a document across the desk that made Marcus's eyes widen. Ms. Sterling's grandmother, Eleanor Sterling, passed away 4 years into your marriage. She left Ms. Sterling $450 million in cash, stock holdings, and real estate. Ms. Sterling never disclosed this inheritance to you, but she used portions of it to fund what you believed were your independent financial successes. The number echoed in Marcus's skull, but he couldn't process its magnitude. $450 million. She'd inherited nearly $500 million while married to him, but she'd hidden it completely, let him strut and preen about his modest achievements while sitting on a fortune that dwarfed anything he could ever dream of earning. Why? The question burst from Marcus, but it carried the weight of genuine confusion rather than accusation. Why hide it? Why let me think I was the breadwinner when you had that kind of money? Rebecca's expression softened slightly, but pain flickered across her features. Because I wanted a husband, not a gold digger. Because I wanted to be loved for who I was, not what I had. Because every time I showed even a hint of success, you became someone I didn't recognize. Petty, jealous, diminished. So I hid it all, let you believe whatever you needed to believe, and tried to make our marriage work despite the fundamental imbalance. She stood and walked to the window, but her silhouette against the bright sky reminded Marcus of all the times he'd taken her presence for granted. My grandmother's will had conditions. I couldn't tell anyone about the inheritance for 5 years, couldn't access the principal for 3 years, couldn't make any major life changes that might be influenced by the money. She wanted me to build my life on my own terms first, then use her money as a foundation for something greater, rather than a crutch or a target for opportunists. But you used it on me, Marcus said, but realization dawned with uncomfortable clarity. The house, the investments, all of it, you were using your inheritance on our marriage. I was trying to save something that was already dying, but I didn't realize it at the time, Rebecca admitted, but she turned to face him again. You started pulling away 2 years into our marriage. You became obsessed with your career, with status markers, with keeping up with colleagues who came from wealthy families. I thought if I quietly gave you the financial foundation you seem to crave, you'd relax, and we could focus on us. But instead, you mistook my generosity for your own accomplishment, and it fed an ego that was already consuming you. Marcus wanted to defend himself, but every justification died on his tongue because he recognized the truth in her words. He'd measured his worth by his bank balance, but even that had been an illusion she'd carefully constructed. He'd prided himself on his investment acumen, but she'd been covering his losses. He'd felt powerful and successful, but it had all been theater, a performance she'd staged so he could play the role he desperately needed. Jennifer started contacting me last year, Rebecca continued, but her voice hardened. Anonymous emails at first, then texts from burner phones, finally a direct message on LinkedIn. She told me about the affair, sent photos, gave me dates and locations. She thought she was being cruel, but actually, she gave me the evidence I needed to start protecting my assets. Marcus's stomach dropped. But the revelation of Jennifer's calculated cruelty somehow hurt worse than Rebecca's exposure of his delusions. She wanted you to know. She wanted to force a divorce so she could marry you, but she assumed, like you did, that I was just a mid-level accountant with a modest income, Rebecca explained, but something almost like pity crossed her face. She thought she was trading up from her previous husband, a teacher who made $52,000 a year. She researched your salary, your job title, your car, and decided you were a better target. She must be very disappointed in how things turned out. The pieces clicked together with devastating precision, but Marcus saw the entire timeline of his affair in a new light. Jennifer's sudden interest in him at company parties, but only after he'd mentioned buying the Aspen property. Her questions about his investments, but always framed as admiration for his financial savvy. Her pushing him toward divorce, but accompanied by promises about the life they'd build together once he escaped his boring marriage. What happens now? Marcus asked, but he already knew the interview was over. His application rejected before it truly began. Am I just another cautionary tale for your executive team? That depends on you, but I didn't bring you here just to gloat, Rebecca said, but she returned to her desk and pulled out another folder. You have skills, Marcus, genuine skills that made you valuable in your previous position. Your crisis management work was actually quite good when you weren't trying to take credit for other people's ideas. Your strategic thinking can be solid when your ego isn't clouding your judgment. And despite everything, you do have a work ethic when properly motivated. Marcus stared at her in confusion, but hope flickered in his chest, despite the devastation of the previous revelations. Are you offering me the position? I'm offering you a choice, but it comes with conditions that will challenge every assumption you have about yourself, Rebecca replied, but her tone shifted to pure business. The senior management position you applied for is gone. I can't hire you for that without creating conflicts of interest that would damage both our professional reputations. But I have a different proposal. She slid the new folder across the desk, but Marcus opened it with trembling hands. The documents outlined a position he hadn't applied for. Senior Crisis Management Consultant, reporting directly to the Chief Operations Officer, but with a salary of $180,000, a fraction of what he'd hoped for, yet still more than he'd been making at his previous job. The position requires you to spend 6 months in our Phoenix office, but you'll be working with our team there to overhaul their crisis response protocols, Rebecca explained, but her eyes held an intensity that demanded his full attention. It's real work, challenging work, and it will require you to prove yourself without any special treatment. You'll be judged solely on your performance, not your history with me, but it comes with conditions. What conditions? Marcus asked, but he braced himself for humiliation or revenge disguised as opportunity. First, you sign a detailed employment contract that includes a morality clause, but it specifically prevents you from leveraging our past relationship in any way. No telling colleagues, no using it for sympathy or advantage, no bringing personal drama into my company, Rebecca outlined, but her voice remained clinical. Second, you undergo 6 months of professional coaching with Dr. Sarah Martinez, a consultant who specializes in executive leadership development. She'll help you address the ego issues and insecurity that sabotaged our marriage and could sabotage your career. Marcus bristled at the characterization, but he couldn't deny its accuracy. And third, you divorce Jennifer immediately, but you do it with a prenuptial agreement that protects the settlement you received from our divorce, Rebecca stated, but her expression brooked no argument. I won't have you destroy your financial future because you're too proud or guilty to protect yourself from an obvious predator. David will provide you with an excellent attorney who will ensure Jennifer gets nothing beyond what she came into the marriage with. The terms felt invasive, controlling, but also weirdly caring, as if Rebecca wanted to save him from himself, despite having every reason to watch him self-destruct. Why would you do this? After everything I did, why give me anything? Rebecca was silent for a long moment, but when she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of carefully considered honesty. Because I'm not doing this for you, Marcus. I'm doing it for the woman I was during our marriage, the woman who hid and diminished herself because she loved you. She deserves to know that her sacrifice wasn't entirely wasted, that you might actually be capable of growth and change if properly motivated. Consider it closure for the person I used to be. She stood, signaling the meeting's end, but Marcus remained frozen in his chair. I need your answer now. Take the position with its conditions, or walk away and figure out your own path. But understand that this offer expires the moment you leave this office, and I won't make it again. Marcus's mind raced through his options, but the reality of his situation crashed over him like a wave. His savings were depleting rapidly, but Jennifer's spending accelerated the drain. His professional reputation was solid but not spectacular, but the gap in his employment history was growing. His pride screamed at him to refuse what felt like charity, but his practical mind recognized that Rebecca was offering him not just a job, but a chance to rebuild his life on a foundation of truth rather than illusion. I'll take it, but I have questions about the coaching requirements, Marcus began, but Rebecca raised a hand to stop him. The coaching isn't negotiable and it's not punishment, she clarified, but something almost like compassion entered her voice. You're intelligent, capable, and hard-working when you're not sabotaging yourself with insecurity and the desperate need to feel superior to everyone around you. Dr. Martinez helped me develop the confidence to build this company while married to you and hiding my success. She can help you develop the confidence to succeed without needing to diminish others. The revelation that Rebecca herself had needed coaching, had struggled with her own issues, somehow made the requirement feel less like an insult and more like a genuine opportunity. When do I start? Phoenix office Monday morning, but David will have your contracts ready by Friday, Rebecca answered, but she pressed a button on her phone. Security will escort you out. Pack for 6 months. Phoenix is significantly different from here, but you'll find the cost of living more manageable on your new salary. Marcus stood on shaky legs, but he paused at the door. Rebecca, I'm sorry. For all of it, the affair, the divorce, the way I treated you during our marriage. I know it doesn't change anything, but I need you to know that I recognize now what I destroyed. Rebecca's expression softened imperceptibly, but her voice remained professional. I appreciate the apology, but I stopped waiting for it 3 months ago. What I need now isn't your remorse. It's your commitment to becoming better than the man who hurt me. Prove that my belief in your potential wasn't completely misplaced, and maybe we can both find some peace in how this ended. The security guard appeared in the doorway, but Marcus took one last look at the woman he'd married and discarded, seeing her clearly for, perhaps, the first time. She'd loved him enough to hide who she was, but he'd loved only the illusion he'd created of their life together. She'd given him everything while asking for nothing, but he'd demanded constant validation while offering only criticism. She'd been extraordinary, but he'd been too ordinary to recognize it. The elevator descent felt faster than the ascent, but Marcus's phone buzzed with incoming messages before he'd reached the ground floor. Jennifer's texts filled his screen, demands about dinner plans, complaints about their apartment's lack of amenities, hints about a designer handbag she'd seen at Neiman Marcus. But each message now read like evidence of his own terrible judgment, rather than the communications of a loving wife. Marcus stepped out onto the street. but the November wind cut through his expensive suit with a chill that matched his internal numbness. His car, purchased with Rebecca's money, he now recognized, sat in the parking garage 3 blocks away, but his feet carried him toward a small coffee shop instead. He needed to think, needed to process the complete destruction and reconstruction of his understanding of the past 7 years. The coffee shop's warmth and familiar scents grounded him, but the barista's cheerful greeting barely registered as he ordered a black coffee and found a corner booth. He pulled out his phone and stared at Jennifer's messages, but now he saw them through the lens of Rebecca's revelations. Every "I love you" preceded by a request for money. Every compliment followed by a comparison to what she deserved. Every moment of affection transactional in ways he'd been too blinded by ego to notice. His phone rang, but Jennifer's photo filled the screen. A selfie she'd taken the day after their wedding, smiling at the camera with eyes that now seemed calculating rather than loving. He let it go to voicemail, but played the message immediately. "Marcus, where are you? The interview was supposed to be over an hour ago. Did you get the job? We need to talk about moving to a better apartment. I found this amazing place in the Arts District, but it's $4,500 a month. Call me back immediately." The entitlement in her tone made his stomach turn, but Marcus deleted the message and opened his contacts. David Chen had sent him the attorney's information while he'd been walking, Monica Patterson, family law specialist, with a note that she was expecting his call. Marcus dialed before he could talk himself out of it, but Monica answered on the second ring with a professional warmth that put him at ease. "Mr. Sullivan, I've been briefed on your situation by David Chen. I understand you need to file for divorce and protect assets from a brief marriage to someone with documented intent to commit financial fraud. When can you come in to discuss the specifics?" The efficiency of Rebecca's network impressed him, but it also highlighted how thoroughly she'd prepared for this moment, not vengefully but practically, like a CEO solving a business problem. "This afternoon, I need to do this before I lose my nerve. 3 o'clock at my office, but bring any financial documents you have access to, especially joint accounts and credit cards," Monica instructed, but her tone carried no judgment. "Mr. Chen has provided me with substantial evidence regarding your wife's pattern of behavior, but the more documentation you can provide, the stronger your case. Arizona is a community property state, which means timing is crucial." Marcus agreed and ended the call, but his hands trembled slightly as he raised his coffee cup. He was about to blow up his life again, divorce his second wife before their marriage had even reached the 6-month mark. But this time he'd be acting from truth rather than delusion. The irony wasn't lost on him that Rebecca was orchestrating his escape from Jennifer the way she'd once orchestrated his false sense of financial success. But now he recognized the gift for what it was. His phone buzzed again, but this time it was an email from Sterling Innovations' HR department. His contract had been drafted with remarkable speed, but the attached documents outlined everything Rebecca had promised: salary, position details, relocation assistance to Phoenix, and the coaching requirements that would begin the following week via video conference until he relocated. Marcus scrolled through the contract's details, but each paragraph reinforced that this wasn't charity disguised as employment. The position had real responsibilities, but challenging deadlines and measurable performance metrics. The coaching wasn't optional therapy, but structured executive development with specific competencies he'd need to demonstrate. The morality clause was standard for senior positions, but it specifically prohibited leveraging personal relationships for professional gain. He signed digitally, but the act felt like closing one chapter of his life and opening another, one where he couldn't coast on illusions or borrowed money or a wife's silent generosity. The confirmation email arrived instantly, but it included another message from Rebecca that made him set down his coffee cup to read carefully. Marcus, I meant what I said about wanting you to succeed. This position isn't a consolation prize or a guilt offering. It's a genuine opportunity that matches your actual skills to real organizational needs. The Phoenix team is struggling with crisis management protocols that your previous experience makes you ideal to address, but success will require you to be honest with yourself about your limitations, to learn from people who know more than you do, and to build rather than take credit for others' building. I believe you're capable of this growth, but only you can prove me right or wrong. AR. The message carried no warmth but no cruelty either, but it reflected the same Rebecca who'd hidden her success to preserve their marriage, someone who saw potential in him that he'd never seen in himself, someone who gave without expecting recognition, someone who'd been extraordinary while he'd been committed to mediocrity, dressed up as ambition. Marcus finished his coffee and stood, but his reflection in the shop's window showed him something different than the man who'd entered the Sterling Innovations building 3 hours earlier. His suit still looked expensive, but he now knew it represented borrowed confidence built on borrowed money. His posture still projected success, but he recognized it as performance rather than substance. His face still held the same features, but somehow his eyes carried the weight of uncomfortable self-knowledge that might finally lead to actual growth. The walk to Monica Patterson's office took 45 minutes, but Marcus used the time to mentally prepare for the coming conversation. He'd need to tell Jennifer he wanted a divorce, but her reaction would likely be volcanic when she realized there was no hidden fortune to claim. He'd need to endure her rage and accusations, but also the social embarrassment of 2 divorces before age 35. He'd need to rebuild his life in Phoenix, away from everyone who knew him. But maybe that distance was exactly what he needed to figure out who he actually was beneath the ego and insecurity that had driven him to destroy the best thing in his life. Monica Patterson's office occupied a modest suite in a professional building, but the reception area's understated elegance spoke to successful practice rather than flashy advertising. The attorney herself appeared shortly after Marcus arrived, a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and eyes that had clearly seen every variety of matrimonial disaster, but retained their compassion despite it all. "Mr. Sullivan, thank you for coming in so quickly," she greeted him, but she guided him to her office with practiced efficiency. "I've reviewed the evidence David Chen provided regarding Mrs. Sullivan's financial behavior patterns. Combined with the short duration of your marriage and Arizona's community property laws, we have a strong case for protecting your premarital assets and the divorce settlement you received from your first marriage." She spread documents across her conference table, but each page detailed Jennifer's documented behavior, the social media posts about their lifestyle that predated their marriage, the screenshots of his financial information she'd collected, the consultation she'd scheduled with a divorce attorney specializing in high net worth cases, even though Marcus's actual worth was far from high. "How did you get all this?" Marcus asked, but he felt uncomfortable with the surveillance implications. "Your ex-wife has been monitoring your new wife for months, but not out of jealousy or revenge. Out of recognition that Ms. Walsh represents a pattern," Monica explained, but she pulled up additional files on her laptop. Jennifer Walsh married her first husband, Daniel Torres, in 2018, divorced in 2019 after documenting his assets and filing for spousal support based on his supposed earning potential. The case was dismissed when it was discovered she'd significantly inflated his worth in court filings. She clicked to another file, but Marcus's stomach sank further. Husband number 2, Bradley Walsh. Yes, she kept his name. Married in 2020, divorced in 2021 under similar circumstances. Bradley was a teacher, but Jennifer claimed he had family money. The divorce revealed no such assets, but Jennifer had accumulated $35,000 in credit card debt in his name during their brief marriage. "And I'm husband number 3, Marcus said, but the words tasted bitter. "You are, but unlike the first two, you have someone protecting you," Monica confirmed, but she slid a draft petition across the table. "We're filing on grounds of fraud, specifically that Mrs. Sullivan misrepresented her intentions in entering the marriage and demonstrated a pattern of financial predation. Arizona law allows us to request that premarital assets and separate property remain separate, but we need to act fast before she can establish claims on community property." Marcus read through the petition, but each paragraph outlined his humiliation in legal language. The affair, the hasty marriage, the pattern of manipulation he'd been too blind or arrogant to see. "What happens when I serve her?" "She'll likely be shocked, then angry, then she'll scramble to find an attorney who will take her case on contingency," Monica predicted, but her tone suggested she'd seen this scenario many times. "But the evidence we have will make it difficult for her to find representation. Most family law attorneys avoid clients with documented fraud patterns, but those who will take such cases typically demand substantial retainers." "How long will this take?" Marcus asked, but he thought about the Monday start date in Phoenix and the need to extract himself from his marriage before beginning his new position. "In Arizona, 30 days minimum from service to finalization if uncontested, but Jennifer will contest," Monica replied, but she made notes on her legal pad. "However, we can file immediately and likely get an emergency order protecting your assets while the divorce proceeds. The evidence of her documented intent will work in our favor." Marcus signed the engagement letter and wrote a check that represented a significant portion of his remaining settlement. Money, but it felt like the first honest financial decision he'd made in months. "When can we file?" "Today, but I'll have the petition ready in 2 hours, Monica promised, but she began typing on her laptop with impressive speed. "You should prepare yourself for the confrontation with Mrs. Sullivan. Have you considered where you'll stay after serving her?" "I'll find a hotel, but I need to pack some things first," Marcus replied, but anxiety tightened his chest at the thought of facing Jennifer. Should I tell her before serving her? Legally, no, but practically, it might be safer to serve her through a process server when you're not present, Monica advised, but her expression held genuine concern. Given her documented behavior and the fact that she's about to lose access to what she thought were substantial assets, her reaction could be volatile. Marcus considered the advice, but something in him rebelled against the idea of hiding behind a process server. He'd spent 7 years lying to Rebecca through omission and delusion, but he'd spent 7 months actively lying to Jennifer and to himself about the foundation of their relationship. He owed it to whatever remained of his integrity to face his second wife and accept responsibility for the disaster he'd created. "I'll tell her myself, but I'll pack first and be ready to leave immediately after," Marcus decided, but Monica's expression suggested she'd heard similar determinations before and knew they rarely went as planned. "Call me immediately if anything escalates, but document everything, texts, threats, any property damage," Monica instructed, but she pulled out her business card and wrote a number on the back. "This is my personal cell. I'll be available if you need help or if the situation becomes unsafe." Marcus left Monica's office but stopped at a storage facility on the way home to rent a unit. He'd pack his essential belongings while Jennifer was out, but leave the furniture and shared items that had come to represent the false life he'd built. The afternoon sun had given way to twilight by the time he pulled into the parking lot of their apartment complex, but his hands gripped the steering wheel as he summoned courage. Jennifer's car sat in their assigned spot, But Marcus's stomach clenched at the confrontation ahead. He climbed the stairs to their second-floor unit, but each step felt heavier than the last. The apartment door opened to reveal Jennifer sprawled on their couch, but shopping bags from 3 different designer stores littered the floor around her, purchases they couldn't afford but that she'd made anyway. "Finally," she said, without looking up from her phone, but her voice carried the petulant annoyance of someone who'd been kept waiting. "Did you get the job? What's the salary? When can we move to a better place?" Marcus set down his keys but didn't remove his suit jacket. "I got a job, but not the one I applied for. I'm moving to Phoenix on Monday for a 6-month assignment, but it pays significantly less than we'd discussed." Jennifer's head snapped up, but her eyes narrowed with calculation rather than concern. "Phoenix? We're moving to Phoenix for how long? What's the salary?" "I'm moving to Phoenix, but you're staying here," Marcus corrected, but he kept his voice steady despite his pounding heart. "I'm filing for divorce, Jennifer. Today. The papers will be served this evening, but I wanted to tell you in person first." For a moment, Jennifer sat frozen, but then she burst into laughter, genuine, delighted laughter that made Marcus's skin crawl. "You're joking! You're seriously joking right now! You're filing for divorce after 3 months of marriage? After I left everything to be with you?" "You left a teacher who made $52,000 a year, but you documented his assets hoping to claim alimony," Marcus replied. But the facts from Monica's research gave him strength. "Before that, you married and divorced Daniel Torres under similar circumstances, but the court found you'd inflated his worth. I'm your 3rd husband in 7 years, Jennifer, and I'm not giving you the chance to add me to your pattern." Jennifer's laughter cut off abruptly, but fury replaced amusement in her expression. "How dare you investigate me? How dare you?" She stopped mid-sentence as understanding dawned. "Rebecca, your ex-wife told you, that bitter bee—" "Rebecca offered me a job and protection from making the same mistake twice, but she also showed me documentation of your documented plan to divorce me within a year and claim half of assets you thought I had." Marcus interrupted, but he pulled out his phone and showed her Monica's evidence screenshots. "You've been planning this divorce since before we were married, but you assumed I had money I don't actually have." Jennifer's face cycled through emotions: shock, anger, calculation, and finally a cold fury that made Marcus step backward. "You have money, the house, the investments, the cars. I've seen the statements. You're trying to hide assets, but my attorney will find them." "Those assets came from my divorce settlement with Rebecca, but they're protected as premarital property," Marcus explained, but he moved toward their bedroom to begin packing. "And they represent about $200,000 total, but nowhere near what you thought. Most of what you saw came from my previous marriage, but during which my ex-wife funded everything while I believed I'd earned it myself." He began pulling clothes from the closet, but Jennifer followed him into the bedroom with her phone already out. "You can't just divorce me. We're married. We have a lease together. I gave up my job to move here with you. You quit your job 3 weeks before our wedding, but you'd already given notice before proposing we get married," Marcus countered, but he'd done enough research that afternoon to understand the timeline. "You planned this entire relationship as a financial transaction, but you picked the wrong mark." Jennifer's facade cracked completely, but the woman who emerged bore little resemblance to the one he'd thought he loved. "Fine. You want the truth? Yes, I researched you. Yes, I encouraged the divorce from your boring wife. Yes, I plan to marry you, wait a year, and file for divorce claiming half of everything. But I didn't lie about my feelings. I genuinely thought we could be happy together while I secured my financial future." The casual admission of mercenary intent should have hurt more than it did, but Marcus felt mostly numbness tinged with self-disgust that he'd fallen for manipulation so transparent. "You'll get nothing from this divorce except what you brought into it, but I'm not interested in punishing you. I just want out." "Nothing? You're giving me nothing after I uprooted my life for you?" Jennifer's voice rose to a shriek, but she grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "I'll take you to court. I'll tell everyone about your affair with me while you were married. I'll destroy your reputation." "My reputation was already destroyed the moment I cheated on Rebecca, but anything you do now just adds to damage I'm already owning," Marcus replied, but he gently removed her hand from his arm. "The papers will outline that you get to keep whatever you brought into the marriage, but I keep my premarital assets and settlement from my previous divorce. Arizona law is clear on this, but particularly when one spouse entered the marriage with documented fraudulent intent." He finished packing his clothes and essential items into a large suitcase, but the apartment's other contents held no significance anymore. Furniture they'd bought together but with money that wasn't really his. Decorations Jennifer had selected to create the lifestyle she craved. Dishes and linens that represented a shared life that had never actually existed. "Where will you go?" Jennifer asked, but her tone had shifted from fury to calculation. "You can't afford this apartment on your own, but I certainly can't either." "I'm staying in a hotel until Monday, but then Phoenix for 6 months," Marcus replied, but he pulled his half of the rent money from his wallet and set it on the dresser. "That covers my portion through December, but you'll need to figure out what you want to do with the lease after that." "You're really leaving," Jennifer said, but something like genuine surprise colored her voice, as if she'd never considered that her plan might fail so completely. "You're actually walking away." "I'm walking away from a mistake before it costs me more than it already has, but I'm also accepting responsibility for that mistake," Marcus clarified, but he took one last look around the bedroom. "I cheated on a woman who loved me, divorced her to marry you, and destroyed my life in the process. But I'm done making decisions based on ego and insecurity and the desperate need to feel like I'm winning at life." He wheeled his suitcase toward the door, but Jennifer's voice stopped him one final time. "She really was rich. Your ex-wife? That's not just something you're saying to justify leaving me." Marcus turned to face her, but he allowed himself a bitter smile. "Rebecca is a billionaire who built a tech empire while married to me, but she hid it because my ego couldn't handle my wife being more successful than me. She funded every success I thought I'd achieved, covered every loss I didn't realize I'd incurred, and loved me enough to diminish herself so I could feel big. And I repaid her by cheating with you and walking away from the best thing that ever happened to me." Jennifer's expression shifted to something like regret mixed with frustration, but Marcus recognized it as disappointment in her failed plan rather than empathy for Rebecca. "So you traded a billionaire for me, but I traded a steady teacher for someone who turned out to be broke. I guess we both got played. The difference is I played myself, but you tried to play me," Marcus replied, but he opened the door. "Good luck, Jennifer. I mean that sincerely. I hope you figure out whatever's driving you to treat marriage as a financial transaction, but that you find something more meaningful before it's too late." He closed the door on her sputtering response, but the sound of breaking glass followed him down the stairs, something thrown in fury at the door, though whether it was a phone or a shopping bag's contents, he couldn't tell and didn't care enough to check. The hotel room Marcus checked into was modest but clean, but its impersonal comfort matched his need for space to process the day's revelations. He sat on the bed and pulled out his phone, but stared at the device for several minutes before finally composing a text to Rebecca. "Contract signed. Divorce filed. Phoenix Monday. Thank you for seeing something worth saving when I couldn't see it myself." He hesitated before hitting send, but added one more line. I'm sorry seems inadequate, but I'll spend the next 6 months trying to become someone who deserves your faith in my potential. The response came faster than he expected, but Rebecca's message carried the same professional distance as her earlier communication. Sorry isn't required, but growth is. Dr. Martinez will contact you tomorrow to schedule your first coaching session. Focus on the work ahead, not the past behind. Marcus set down his phone and lay back on the unfamiliar bed, but his mind raced through the day's events like a highlight reel of his own destruction and possible redemption. He'd walked into that office expecting a job interview, but found instead a mirror that reflected his worst qualities and smallest moments. He'd faced the truth about his failed marriage to Rebecca, but also the predatory nature of his marriage to Jennifer. He'd seen himself through others' eyes, but the view had been devastating and clarifying in equal measure. Sleep came eventually, but Marcus's dreams mixed memories of Rebecca, working quietly at their kitchen table with visions of the powerful CEO she'd become once freed from his ego's constraints. He saw himself from outside, a man so desperate to feel successful that he'd sabotaged actual success, so obsessed with appearing superior that he'd failed to recognize genuine excellence standing beside him. Friday morning arrived with gentle sunlight through the hotel curtains, but Marcus woke with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. His phone showed messages from Monica confirming Jennifer had been served the night before and had, as predicted, reacted with fury and threats but no concrete legal action. The divorce would proceed, but Marcus's assets were protected, pending the final settlement. Dr. Sarah Martinez's email arrived over breakfast, but her message established expectations for their coaching relationship. Mr. Sullivan, I look forward to working with you over the next 6 months. Our first session will be Monday at 9 a.m. via video conference, 1 hour before your Phoenix office orientation. Please review the attached assessment questionnaire and complete it honestly. Your growth depends on your willingness to be truthful about your limitations. The questionnaire explored topics Marcus had never considered about himself, but questions about his self-worth, his need for external validation, his relationship patterns, and his definitions of success forced uncomfortable introspection. He spent 3 hours answering honestly, but each question peeled back another layer of the defensive mechanisms he'd built to protect his fragile ego. The weekend passed in a blur of packing, closing accounts, and preparing for relocation, but Marcus also spent hours researching sterling innovations and the Phoenix crisis management challenges he'd been hired to address. The company's public information revealed what Rebecca had built, a tech empire focused on cloud infrastructure security, but with a reputation for ethical business practices and substantial charitable giving. Employee reviews consistently praised the company culture, but also mentioned the mysterious CEO, whose brilliance was legendary, but whose personal life remained completely private. Monday morning found Marcus on a plane to Phoenix, but his laptop was open to Dr. Martinez's video conference platform before the flight attendants had finished their safety demonstration. Her face appeared on screen at exactly 9 a.m., but the woman in her late 60s had eyes that seemed to see directly through his carefully maintained facades. Marcus, thank you for joining me despite your travel schedule, Dr. Martinez began, but her tone was warm without being permissive. I've reviewed your assessment responses, but I want to start by acknowledging something important. You demonstrated more self-awareness in those answers than most executives show after months of coaching. You're already further along than you realize. The unexpected validation caught Marcus off guard, but he felt defensive rather than grateful. Rebecca probably told you everything. You're seeing what she showed you, not what I actually wrote. And there's the first issue we'll work on, but I appreciate you demonstrating it so quickly. Dr. Martinez replied, but her expression remained neutral. When someone offers you genuine recognition, your immediate response is to deflect, minimize, and assume manipulation. That defensive reflex has been protecting your ego, but it's also prevented you from accepting real feedback that could help you grow. Marcus opened his mouth to argue, but stopped himself because she was right. His first instinct had been to reject her compliment rather than accept it. That's fair. I did that. You did, but you also just caught yourself and acknowledged it, which demonstrates the capacity for self-correction that will make our work together successful, Dr. Martinez continued, but she pulled up what looked like his assessment responses. Your answers reveal someone who's built an entire identity around external validation, money, status, appearance, career titles, but has never developed internal measures of worth. When those external markers were threatened, you made destructive choices to preserve them, rather than examining whether they actually represented who you wanted to be. The analysis cut deep, but Marcus forced himself to listen rather than defend. Rebecca said you helped her develop confidence while hiding her success from me. How did you do that? By helping her understand that true confidence doesn't require external validation, but it also doesn't require hiding from others' insecurities, Dr. Martinez explained. But her tone gentled. Rebecca came to me 5 years into your marriage, but she was considering revealing her company and wealth to you. We worked through her fears about your reaction, but ultimately she decided the risk to your marriage was too great. In retrospect, perhaps that was the wrong choice. Maybe forcing the confrontation earlier would have saved you both years of struggle. Or maybe I would have divorced her then and saved her the humiliation of my affair, Marcus countered, but he surprised himself with the honesty. Perhaps, but that decision would have been yours to make based on truth, rather than both of you living in constructed illusions, Dr. Martinez replied, but she shifted topics slightly. Our work together will focus on 3 core areas. First, developing authentic self-worth that isn't dependent on external validation. Second, learning to recognize and appreciate others' excellence without feeling diminished by it. And third, building professional and personal relationships based on mutual respect rather than competition. The session continued for the full hour, but by its end, Marcus felt simultaneously exhausted and energized. Dr. Martinez assigned homework, journaling exercises about moments when he'd felt genuinely proud versus moments when he'd felt threatened by others' success. But the work required more emotional honesty than any professional development he'd ever undertaken. The Phoenix office of Sterling Innovations occupied a modern building in the downtown corridor, but the team Marcus met reflected the diversity and competence that characterized Rebecca's leadership. His new manager, Patricia Chen, no relation to David apparently, Chen was a common surname, was a no-nonsense woman in her 40s who'd built the Phoenix division from 3 employees to over 200 in just 5 years. Marcus, welcome to Phoenix, but understand that you're here because you have specific skills we need, not because of any connection to our CEO, Patricia stated during their first meeting, but her directness was refreshing rather than hostile. Your crisis management work at your previous company was impressive, but you'll need to adapt our systems, which are more complex than what you're used to. Can you handle being a student again, rather than the expert in the room? The question tested his ego immediately, but Marcus thought of Dr. Martinez's coaching before responding. I can, but I appreciate you being direct about the expectation. What's the biggest crisis management gap you're currently facing? Patricia's expression shifted to approval, but she pulled up a complex diagram on her monitor. We have excellent protocols for technical crises, but we're weak on stakeholder communication during those crises. Clients, board members, partners, They all need different information at different times, but our current system treats everyone the same. Your background in corporate communications makes you ideal to overhaul that system, but it will require you to understand our technical side first before you can translate it effectively. The work was challenging, detail-oriented, and required Marcus to ask questions constantly rather than pretend expertise he didn't have. But each day felt more rewarding than years of his previous career, where he'd focused more on appearing competent than actually learning. His Phoenix colleagues were welcoming but not deferential, but they evaluated him purely on his contributions rather than his title or appearance. Dr. Martinez's sessions continued weekly, but each one peeled back more layers of the defensive mechanisms Marcus had built over decades. They explored his childhood as the youngest son of successful older brothers, but how he'd learned early that he couldn't compete with their achievements and had instead focused on style over substance. They examined his relationship history, but patterns emerged of choosing partners who needed him rather than challenged him, until Rebecca, who'd threatened his identity by being more capable than he could handle. You've spent your whole life trying to be the smartest person in the room, but what if the goal was to be in rooms with people smarter than you and learn from them? Dr. Martinez asked during their 8th session, but the question reframed everything. Marcus thought about the Phoenix team, brilliant engineers, strategic thinkers, creative problem solvers who forgot more about technology each day than he'd ever learn. But for the first time in his life, their excellence didn't make him feel diminished. Instead, it made him curious, eager to understand their perspectives, willing to admit ignorance in service of genuine learning. 3 months into the Phoenix assignment, Marcus's crisis communication overhaul was taking shape, but the system he'd designed received genuine praise from Patricia and her leadership team. More importantly, he'd stopped taking credit for ideas that emerged from collaborative sessions and had started explicitly acknowledging others' contributions, a practice that initially felt like weakness but increasingly felt like integrity. His divorce from Jennifer finalized in early February, but the settlement protected his premarital assets, as Monica had promised. Jennifer had tried to contest, but the documented evidence of her fraudulent intent had made finding representation difficult. She'd walked away with what she'd brought into the marriage, approximately $8,000 in personal belongings and her car, but her angry voicemails and texts had eventually stopped when she realized Marcus had no intention of engaging with her manipulation. The absence of Jennifer created space for Marcus to examine his relationship with Rebecca more honestly, but what emerged wasn't romantic longing. That had died the moment he recognized how thoroughly he'd betrayed her, but profound respect mixed with genuine remorse for wasted years. She'd been extraordinary, but he'd demanded she be ordinary so he could feel superior. She'd offered partnership, but he'd insisted on hierarchy with himself at the top. She'd loved him authentically, but he'd loved only the reflection of himself he saw in her diminishment. April brought the halfway point of his Phoenix assignment, but Patricia called Marcus into her office with an unexpected proposal. Your crisis communication system is exceeding expectations, but I want you to present it to the executive team at headquarters next month. It's the kind of innovation that could be scaled across all our divisions, but it needs CEO approval for that level of implementation. Marcus's stomach clenched, but the prospect of seeing Rebecca again after 4 months apart filled him with anxiety mixed with a strange eagerness to show her his growth. Will Ms. Sterling be in that meeting? She will, but this is a professional presentation based on merit, not personal history, Patricia replied, but her expression suggested she knew more about his connection to Rebecca than she'd let on. Your system is genuinely excellent, Marcus. You've earned this opportunity through your work, not through any relationship to our CEO. The validation felt different than praise used to, less about feeding his ego and more about genuine recognition of contribution. I'll prepare the presentation, but I'd like to include the team members who helped develop the ideas. This wasn't just my work. Patricia's smile widened, but she nodded approvingly. That's exactly the approach that will succeed with Ms. Sterling. She values collaboration over individual glory, but you seem to have learned that during your time here. The month before the presentation flew by in intensive preparation, but Marcus found himself excited rather than anxious about the work. He coordinated with team members to ensure everyone's contributions were properly credited, but the collaborative process produced a stronger result than anything he could have created alone. Dr. Martinez helped him prepare for the emotional aspects of seeing Rebecca again, but she emphasized focusing on the professional opportunity rather than personal history. You're not the same man who walked into her office 7 months ago, but she'll need to see that through your actions rather than your words, Dr. Martinez advised during their final pre-presentation session. Show her the growth through how you conduct yourself, how you credit others, how you handle questions and challenges to your ideas. The flight back to headquarters felt surreal, but Marcus found himself looking forward to seeing Rebecca despite the complicated history. The man boarding that plane bore little resemblance to the one who'd left Phoenix 7 months earlier, not in appearance, which remained largely the same, but in the internal confidence that no longer required external validation to maintain. The presentation was scheduled for 2 p.m. in Sterling Innovation's main conference room, but Marcus arrived early to set up and review his notes. The executive team filtered in gradually, Patricia from Phoenix via video conference, the COO, CFO, heads of various departments. But Rebecca entered last, her presence commanding immediate attention without any apparent effort. She'd changed her hair since he'd last seen her, shorter now, but styled in a way that emphasized her features rather than hiding them. Her expression remained professionally neutral, but her eyes met his for just a moment with something that might have been curiosity before she took her seat at the head of the table. Good afternoon, everyone, but let's begin with Marcus Sullivan's presentation on his crisis communication overhaul, Rebecca announced, but her tone gave no indication of their personal history. Marcus, the floor is yours. Marcus stood and took a deep breath, but his hands remained steady as he began his presentation. Thank you, Ms. Sterling. Before I start, I want to acknowledge that this system represents collaborative work from our Phoenix team, but I'll be crediting specific contributors as we move through each component. He launched into the presentation, but his delivery reflected months of Dr. Martinez's coaching, confident without being arrogant, comprehensive without being defensive, open to questions rather than treating them as challenges. When the CFO questioned cost projections, Marcus acknowledged uncertainties honestly, rather than bluffing expertise. When the COO suggested modifications, Marcus genuinely considered the feedback rather than defending his original design. Rebecca watched throughout, but her expression remained unreadable until the presentation concluded, with strong support from the executive team. Thank you, Marcus, but I have one question, she said, and the room fell silent. Your system emphasizes collaborative communication and shared credit for crisis resolution. That represents a significant philosophical shift from your previous work at your last company, where you tended to centralize both authority and recognition. What changed? The question was fair but pointed, but Marcus recognized it as an opportunity to demonstrate growth rather than defend past behavior. What changed was that I had to confront that my previous approach wasn't actually successful. It just looked successful because I was taking credit for others' work and avoiding accountability for failures. Working with Dr. Martinez and the Phoenix team taught me that genuine excellence comes from enabling others to contribute their best work, but recognizing that my role is facilitation rather than domination. Rebecca's expression softened almost imperceptibly, but she nodded. That's a significant evolution in your professional philosophy, but it's also reflected in the quality of your work here. The board will review your proposal, but I'm prepared to recommend full implementation across all divisions. The meeting concluded with handshakes and congratulations, but Rebecca caught his eye as people filed out. "Marcus, do you have a moment?" His heart rate accelerated, but Marcus nodded and followed her to her office, the same space where his world had detonated 7 months earlier, but now felt less like a chamber of judgment and more like just another professional space. Rebecca closed the door but gestured for him to sit. "Patricia tells me you've been exceptional in Phoenix, but more importantly, she says you've been genuinely collaborative and willing to learn. That's not the Marcus Sullivan I knew during our marriage." "It's not the Marcus Sullivan I knew either, but I'm still figuring out who I actually am beneath all the ego and insecurity," Marcus admitted, but he maintained eye contact rather than looking away. "The coaching has been transformative, but also incredibly difficult, having to examine all the ways I sabotaged our marriage, and my own potential has been humbling doesn't begin to cover it. I'm glad you're finding value in the work, but I want you to understand something important," Rebecca said, but she leaned forward slightly. "I didn't arrange this opportunity because I wanted to fix you or save you or prove something about our past relationship. I did it because you genuinely had skills that matched organizational needs, but you were sabotaging your own potential with patterns you'd never examined. The work you've done is for yourself, not for me. I know, but I'm still grateful that you saw something worth investing in when I couldn't see it myself," Marcus replied, but he paused before continuing. "I've wanted to apologize properly for months, but Dr. Martinez advised me to focus on changing behavior rather than seeking forgiveness. So instead of asking you to absolve me, I just want you to know that I understand now what I destroyed. You were extraordinary, but I demanded you be ordinary. You loved me authentically, but I loved only the illusion I'd created. And I'm sorry, not because I want anything from you, but because you deserved so much better than what I gave you." Rebecca's eyes glistened briefly, but she maintained her composure. "Thank you for that, but what you're describing wasn't entirely your fault. I made choices too, to hide my success, to enable your insecurity, to prioritize preserving our marriage over forcing us both to face uncomfortable truths. We were both building on false foundations, but my contribution to that dynamic was significant even if your choices ultimately ended it." The acknowledgement of shared responsibility felt generous, but Marcus recognized it as truth rather than absolution. "What happens now, with my contract, I mean? The Phoenix assignment ends in 2 months. "That depends on what you want, but you have options," Rebecca replied, but she pulled up a file on her computer. "Patricia wants to keep you in Phoenix permanently, but as Associate Director of Crisis Management, a promotion with significant salary increase. Alternatively, we have a similar position opening at our Seattle office, but you'd be building that program from scratch. Or you could return here to headquarters, but that might be professionally complicated given our history." Marcus considered the options, but the answer felt clear. "Phoenix has been good for me, but the team there has become something like a professional family. If Patricia wants me to stay, I'd like to accept that position." "Then consider it done, but congratulations on earning the promotion through your work rather than connections," Rebecca said, but she stood to signal the meeting's conclusion. "Marcus, I mean what I said about your growth being for yourself, but I'm genuinely happy to see you becoming someone who can recognize and appreciate excellence without feeling threatened by it. That's the Marcus I hoped might emerge when we first met, but that got buried under insecurity and ego." I'm working on it every day, but some days are easier than others, Marcus admitted, but he stood as well. May I ask you something personal? Rebecca hesitated but nodded. You can ask, but I may not answer. Are you happy? Now, I mean, without me and without having to hide who you are, Marcus asked, but the question carried genuine curiosity rather than any hidden agenda. Rebecca's expression softened into something almost like peace, but her answer was simple. I'm getting there, but building a life based on truth rather than carefully constructed illusions takes time. I still sometimes want to hide my success to make others comfortable, but I'm working on that with Dr. Martinez too. We're both works in progress, Marcus, but at least now we're making progress honestly. Marcus left Sterling Innovations headquarters that afternoon with a lightness he hadn't felt in years, but the weight of understanding had replaced the burden of delusion. The flight back to Phoenix gave him time to reflect on the journey from that devastating October divorce announcement to this April afternoon where he'd presented professional work he was genuinely proud of, not because it made him look good, but because it would help people. Dr. Martinez's session the following week focused on integration, but on taking the lessons learned and applying them beyond just work. You've made remarkable progress professionally, but the real test is whether these changes extend into all areas of your life, she observed, but her tone carried pride in his development. How are you doing personally? Dating, friendships, family relationships? I'm not dating, but I'm not ready for that yet, Marcus replied honestly, but he'd thought about this question extensively. I need to be comfortable being alone first. Need to develop the kind of internal stability that doesn't require another person to validate my worth. As for friendships, I've been building genuine connections with the Phoenix team, but it's different than before, based on shared interests and mutual respect, rather than networking or image management. That's wise self-awareness, but what about your family? Dr. Martinez probed, but Marcus felt his defenses activate before consciously relaxing them. I called my brothers last month, but admitted to them that I'd spent my whole life competing with their accomplishments instead of building my own, Marcus said. But the conversation had been difficult, yet liberating. They were surprised but supportive, but they also shared that they'd felt I'd always been distant and defensive around them. We're working on rebuilding relationships based on honesty rather than competition. The remaining weeks of Marcus's Phoenix assignment flew by in productive work and continued personal development, but the transition from temporary consultant to permanent associate director felt natural rather than abrupt. His promotion came with new responsibilities but also new collaborators, and Marcus found himself genuinely excited about mentoring junior team members the way he'd been mentored during his own growth journey. Jennifer resurfaced briefly in June with emails demanding additional settlement money, but her claims were easily dismissed by Monica Patterson. The final communication came in the form of a Facebook post announcing Jennifer's engagement to her fourth husband, a venture capitalist she'd met at a tech conference, but whose actual net worth was likely the subject of her usual thorough investigation. Marcus felt nothing but vague pity for the man, and relief that he'd escaped before Jennifer had successfully executed her plan. A year after that devastating interview, Marcus found himself back at Sterling Innovations headquarters for the annual leadership conference, but this time as an invited presenter, sharing his crisis communication system's success metrics. The system had been implemented across all divisions, but had saved the company millions in potential reputation damage during 2 significant technical outages. His presentation received genuine applause, but what mattered more was the pride he felt in work that had genuinely helped people rather than just advanced his career. Rebecca attended his presentation but approached him afterward at the networking reception. Congratulations on your success, but I've been following the metrics Patricia shares. Your system has exceeded even our optimistic projections. It's been a team effort, but I appreciate the recognition, Marcus replied, but he noticed Rebecca wore different jewelry than during their marriage. Bold pieces that suggested confidence rather than the understated accessories she'd worn to avoid his jealous comments. You look happy, really happy, not just professionally successful, but genuinely content. I'm getting there, but it's an ongoing process, Rebecca admitted, but she paused before continuing. I've been dating someone, another CEO actually, but someone who celebrates my success rather than feeling threatened by it. It's refreshing to be in a relationship built on mutual respect rather than careful management of someone's ego. The information should have stung, but Marcus found himself genuinely happy for her. That's wonderful, Rebecca. You deserve someone who sees your excellence as something to celebrate rather than hide. Thank you, but I appreciate that you can say that sincerely, Rebecca replied, but her expression carried warmth rather than the professional distance of their earlier interactions. You've come remarkably far in a year, Marcus. Dr. Martinez tells me you're one of her greatest success stories, not because you changed overnight, but because you committed to the hard work of changing incrementally every day. I had a good reason to commit to that work, but also a good support system, Marcus acknowledged, but he gestured around the room filled with Sterling Innovations employees. This company that you built, the culture you've created, it's made growth possible in ways my previous environment never did. Thank you for giving me that opportunity even when I didn't deserve it. You're welcome, but you earned it through your willingness to change, Rebecca corrected, but she raised her glass in a toast. To growth, honesty, and second chances, not with each other, but with ourselves. Marcus clinked his glass against hers, but the gesture felt like closure on one chapter and the opening of another. They weren't destined to reconcile romantically. Too much had broken. Too much had been built on false foundations. But they'd found something perhaps more valuable, mutual respect born from honest confrontation with their shared past and individual growth from its lessons. The evening concluded with conversations and connections, but Marcus found himself surrounded by colleagues who'd become genuine friends, people who knew his history, his mistakes, his journey from ego-driven manipulation to authentic collaboration. Patricia pulled him aside at one point with news of another promotion opportunity, but Marcus felt no desperate scramble to accept immediately. Instead, he asked for time to consider whether the position aligned with his values and goals, rather than just his ambition. Flying back to Phoenix the next morning, Marcus reflected on the bizarre journey that had brought him from that October evening serving divorce papers to Rebecca, through the devastating interview revelation, the Phoenix assignment that had transformed him, and finally to this place of genuine professional success, built on authentic competence rather than borrowed money and inflated ego. His phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Martinez. Heard your presentation was excellent, but I'm not surprised. You've done the work, Marcus, but more importantly, you've become someone who can sustain the growth rather than just perform it temporarily. Proud of you. Marcus smiled and typed a response. Thank you for helping me become someone I can be proud of instead of someone I just pretended to be. The work continues, but now I actually want to do it rather than resenting what it reveals. The plane descended toward Phoenix, but Marcus looked out at the desert landscape that had become his unexpected home and felt something he'd never experienced before. Genuine contentment not dependent on external validation, relationship status, salary figures, or how he compared to others. He was simply Marcus Sullivan, Associate Director of Crisis Management at Sterling Innovations. But more importantly, he was someone committed to growth, honesty, and building his life on foundations of truth rather than illusion. Rebecca Sterling had been right about so many things, but perhaps most importantly about this: growth required honesty, change required humility, and success worth having came from recognizing excellence in others rather than demanding they diminish themselves so you could feel superior. He'd learned those lessons the hardest way possible, but he'd learned them thoroughly enough that they'd become part of who he was rather than just ideas he intellectually understood. The $450 million inheritance Rebecca had hidden, the billion-dollar company she'd built, the professional excellence she'd achieved. All of it had been there during their marriage, but he'd been too blinded by ego to see it, too threatened by her potential to let her shine, too desperate to feel superior to recognize when he was in the presence of someone extraordinary. He'd destroyed the best thing in his life because he couldn't handle being married to someone more successful than himself. But that destruction had ultimately forced growth he might never have undertaken otherwise. As Marcus collected his luggage and headed to his car in the Phoenix airport parking garage, he thought about the interview that had changed everything, not because Rebecca had offered him revenge or punishment or even forgiveness, but because she'd offered him the truth about himself and the tools to do something with that truth. She could have destroyed him professionally, could have let him spiral into unemployment and bitterness, could have used her power and resources to make his life miserable. Instead, she'd shown him mercy disguised as opportunity, forced growth disguised as employment, and given him the chance to become someone worth being rather than just someone who looked successful on the surface. That was the Rebecca he'd been too blind to appreciate during their marriage. Brilliant, generous, strategic, and ultimately far more concerned with justice and growth than with revenge. The Arizona sun beat down as Marcus drove toward his apartment, but the heat felt cleansing rather than oppressive. He'd survived the worst year of his life, but had emerged from it as someone fundamentally different than the man who'd entered it. The journey wasn't over. Dr. Martinez had made clear that growth was ongoing, that old patterns could reemerge under stress, that vigilance was required to maintain progress. But for the first time in his life, Marcus felt equipped for that journey, but also genuinely committed to it, not because someone was watching or judging, but because he'd experienced what it felt like to live authentically, rather than performatively. He'd felt the difference between genuine accomplishment and borrowed success, between real confidence and defensive arrogance, between relationships built on truth and those built on carefully maintained illusions. Rebecca Sterling had given him many things during their marriage: money, opportunity, patience, love, but the greatest gift had come after its ending: the truth about himself and the chance to do something with that truth. He'd walked into her office a year ago expecting a job interview, but received instead an education in who he'd been, who he'd failed to become, and who he might still become if he committed to the difficult work of honest growth. That education continued every day in Phoenix, but Marcus found himself grateful for each lesson, each moment of uncomfortable self-recognition, each opportunity to choose authentic development over defensive performance. He was building a life worth living rather than just a life that looked impressive from the outside, and the difference was everything. The end of Marcus's story wasn't a fairy tale reconciliation or a dramatic reversal of fortune, but something perhaps more valuable: genuine growth earned through difficult work, authentic relationships built on mutual respect, and professional success that reflected real competence rather than borrowed glory. He'd lost everything that wasn't real to discover what actually mattered, but in the process he'd found something worth more than the illusions he'd destroyed: himself, honest and flawed and working every day to become better. Rebecca Sterling had moved on to a life that didn't include him, but she'd left him with the tools and opportunity to build a life that worked without needing to diminish anyone else to feel valuable. That was the true inheritance from their failed marriage, not money or opportunity or even forgiveness, but the truth that set them both free to become who they actually were, rather than who they'd pretended to be. And in the end, that truth was worth more than $450 million could ever be.